evening, everybody. It's good to be back. Wednesday night, Holocaust education, 7 o'clock from Bethel House in North Wales. I'm Mike Fry, the pastor of Father's House in North Wales, and I want to welcome you all to this third session on Holocaust, and to try and take in some of the information I give. I hope you can take it in. I hope you can kind of assimilate that into your thoughts regarding Holocaust and how Holocaust came about, because as Holocaust research continues, then more information is available, and as the archives are delved into more and more, then we find new information regarding different aspects of Holocaust, things that have been hidden, things that have not yet been researched, and to have places like Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Memorial in Washington and various museums throughout Europe is a real blessing, because people who want to investigate more can, and it's really helpful for our understanding about Holocaust, and our understanding needs to come from not just what happened in Holocaust, but what led up to it. And for the last two sessions, we've been looking at how the hatred against the Jews was created in the minds of ordinary people throughout Europe, but in other places in the world as well, and that includes the United Kingdom and the United States, and more research is taking place at the moment regarding anti-Semitism in the States and in the UK, which resulted in us being, to an extent, bystanders in the Holocaust. And I'm going to bring some of that research to you later on in later sessions, when we look at things like eugenics and the American assistance to Germany in recording details of Jews, but also those who are mentally and physically handicapped, in order that the genocide of Holocaust could take place swiftly and with order, which is what Germany wanted to do. So we're going to be looking at that later, and we're going to be looking at other aspects of Holocaust. But for tonight, we want to begin again with looking at what started the Holocaust, what actually happened in the years just prior to the beginning of the First World War that enabled ordinary people to hate Jews so much that they were able to kill them en masse. And we've looked at some aspects of that. And where we left off last week was we were looking at what the Catholic Church had said in the years between 1933 and 1939 regarding the Jewish people, and how they helped stage this hatred against the Jews prior to and during the Holocaust. But tonight we're going to look at a group as well who, for me, were probably more anti-Semitic and were more influential to the Nazi Party in driving this idea of elimination of the Jews, and that is the Lutheran Church in Germany. And one of probably the world's experts on that is a lady by the name of Susanne Heschel, who wrote a really good book called Aryan Jesus, and she's delved into the German Christian Church in some depth, and a really good piece of research. And also Doris Bergen, she wrote a book called A Twisted Cross, which gives us some information as well. But we want to look at that. But I'm also looking at and introducing you to some of the things that happened just prior to the Holocaust in America and in the UK, which will give you a flavor of the level of anti-Semitism, not only in Europe, but also in the UK and particularly in America, which actually enabled ourselves to be the bystanders, and the Americans to be the bystanders, which helped Germany actually do what they wanted to do, which was to try and eliminate the Jews of Europe. So we're going to look at these different things tonight, and I hope that you enjoy learning but I know you won't enjoy some of the facts and some of the things that I'll talk to you about, but enjoy the learning of how Holocaust actually was enabled by not only the Nazi Party, but other groups of people, including, and in the main, the Lutheran Church in Germany. So I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint presentation, which normally I would give on in a group and a class situation, but I can't do that because of the lockdown. So what we're going to do is I'm going to read it, so my eyes do fall down a little bit, and these are my notes really. And we finished off last week with looking at the starting to look at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Prussia. But before we carry on with the Lutheran Church, I'm just going to give you some background about what was happening. And first of all, I'm going to talk about a good thing that was happening, and that is the support of the Labour Party prior to the First World War for the Jewish people, and how things have changed now in the Labour Party. But I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what they were doing just before the war, because there were people trying to help and support Jews. We're going to look, though, tonight in the main at those who were trying to enable the elimination of Jews. But let's just have a look at some good news first. In October 1938, the Zionist Federation organized a series of meetings around the UK. The majority of the speakers were Labour MPs, supported by NEC members and local trade union members. During March 1939, a petition demanding that the government allow further immigration of Jews into Israel was signed by over 250,000 Labour Party members, union members, and cooperative branch members. Now, during 1938 and 1939, joint conferences between Labour's MPs and trade unions and Jewish Zionist groups were held all over the country. In 1939, the Palestine Labour Political Committee held a conference in Southport, that's in the north of England for you who are watching this from abroad, attended by numerous Labour MPs and trade unionists. At that conference, a film was shown called The Land of Promise, and was received by all as being confirmation of the need for a Jewish state in what was then called Palestine. So we can see that there were movements that were taking place in favor of the Jews. And when we look at the aspect of immigration of Jews into the UK and into America, we know that there were moves afoot for German and Austrian Jews to be allowed to immigrate into the UK and also into America, and we allowed 60,000 Jews from Austria and Germany into the UK. But there were blocks to that in many ways, and I think I said last week, I spoke about and just touched on the fact that Jews who were from the Eastern Bloc or Italy were not allowed into the UK and America because of ideas of eugenics that were highly emotive at the time. So we can look at the Labour Party then, who were trying to help the Jewish people, and actually were trying to establish Israel as a country for the Jewish people to save them facing the persecution that they were certainly facing in Germany at the time. That was 1938 and 1939. Now I've got a book here called Forced Out by a lady called Judith Ornstein, who edited a book, and she's edited another book called Whitewashed, which talks about the Labour Party, who today, and certainly up until recently, were proved to be very anti-Semitic in a lot of their ways, and certainly anti-Zionist, which is anti-Semitism. And Judith has produced this book called Forced Out, and it's by Labour politicians and people from the House of Lords who were forced out of the Labour Party in the last 2 or 3 years because of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. So I recommend that book to you, which is not about Holocaust, but it is about a complete shift from the times just before the Second World War to where we are today. So that is where the Labour Party was. Now, on the opposite side, the far right, in the UK were particularly anti-Semitic. And one of the leaders of the anti-Semitic far-right movements in the UK was Sir Oswald Mosley. He was the 6th Baronet, and was a British politician who rose to fame in the 1920s as a member of Parliament, and later in the 1930s he became a leader of the British Union of Fascists. Fascism was very popular in the UK at that time, and he led a large group of fascists called Black Shirts, and he himself was a particularly nasty anti-Semite. He arranged marches, demonstrations on behalf of the supporters of the Nazi Party and right-wing fascists, and he was no stranger to anti-Semitism, and actually promulgated anti-Semitism in his writings and in his speeches. Now, Mosley was actually arrested at the beginning of the war, and he was detained for 3 years because of his support for Nazi Germany. But he had a huge support here in the UK as well, because anti-Semitism and fascism was rising here. So he was detained for these 3 years in the war to stop him breeding hatred really towards the British government at the time, who were fighting Nazi Germany, and Mosley didn't think we should be fighting Nazi Germany. So a particularly cruel anti-Semitic message he was giving out to ordinary people here in the UK. Now, in an interview in 1975, which you'll get on the internet, if you Google Oswald Mosley interview 1975, he was asked about his anti-Semitism and what he thought of the Jews. And what he said in that interview was that Jews were to blame for the Second World War. And that was in 1975, after his release, obviously, and after he lived a good lifestyle in the UK here with quite a lot of support from various right-wing organizations. But that's what he said in this interview. And as I say, you can Google that. But Oswald Mosley gave us some idea, or history about him gives us some idea as to the atmosphere in the UK. It wasn't all anti-Nazi, and people like Mosley were very big players in supporting the Nazis from within the British society. Now, pre-war USA anti-Semitism, and I'm only touching on these. I've got some really good books here that tell the story about people like Mosley, but I've also looked and read a lot about anti-Semitism in the USA, because there were some significant anti-Semites in the USA between 1920 and 1939 who actually drove an anti-Semitic voice in the UK, in the USA, and actually helped to restrict the number of immigrants into the USA by the amount of support that they had. And one of those was Henry Ford, and another was Father Charles Gutmann. Now, both these men were significant people within the United States society. Charles Gutmann was actually a Catholic priest, and he made a lot of radio presentations to the American public, both Catholic and Protestant, and he had a huge support from the Protestant community in America. And he sent out radio messages and sermons which were particularly anti-Semitic, and he actually gained a huge amount of support. Now, what happened is that his support was so great that he received more mail than Roosevelt, the president at the time. He also had his own post offices, and mail was checked for him because of the amount of mail that were coming in, not against him. This mail was for him. So you can imagine how much anti-Semitic support there was in America prior to the war, which is one of the reasons that America were kind of bystanders in this story of immigration into emigration from Europe by Jews who were fleeing the persecution. And I've got some of the discourses from the his radio messages, and they are particularly anti-Semitic and not very nice. And you can read other books about Father Gutmann. He's quite famous, really, in terms of Holocaust education in regard to the USA. So another one, and you probably, many of you will know this, is Henry Ford, the motor manufacturer. Now, Henry Ford, again, particularly anti-Semitic. Henry Ford was a very wealthy man, very influential, and his story is really that as a child, he grew up listening to stories from Christian men who would tell. Guffey was one of those storytellers who told him stories from the books of Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare and other British writers, historical writers, were anti-Semitic, and they would tell stories about Shylock, etc. So Ford grew up with McGuffey telling stories over the radio at the time, and telling stories about the Jew who was rich and wanted to rule the world, etc. And it formulated an idea in Ford's mind that Jews were a danger to society. And he grew that anti-Semitism into something which was particularly strong and influential in America. I've got a book here by Neil Baldwin on Henry Ford, and what Henry Ford did, he started a newspaper, got journalists together, he paid them, and it was called the Dearborn Independent, and it was a newspaper that was actually a newspaper that was used for anti-Semitism, and it had a huge following, this newspaper. So did Ford, actually, and Ford became really a voice, like Gutmann, at the same time, became a voice for the anti-Semites in America, in the USA. Now, Ford went one step further, because what he did, he copied the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, I can't remember whether we've already spoken about the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but they were 17 lies about Jews, which were created in Russia in 1880. Yes, I think we have spoken about them. And they told lies about Jews wanting to rule the world, being big money grabbers, if you like. All these false anti-Semitic tropes that we're common with today, really, when we hear people criticizing Israel as being an occupying force. Same kind of lies, really. And what Ford did was he wrote up the protocols of the Elders of Zion into a book called The International Jew. Now, this book really was written in a way that caused people to believe that the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were lies, were actually true. And he wrote a lot about how Jews wanted to rule the world and wanted to take over the finances of the world, were actually in control of the finances. And he created such a huge amount of hatred by writing this book. As I say, it's called The International Jew. And that book wasn't only significant in America, but actually Ford was given a medal by Hitler for his support for what Hitler was doing with the Jewish people in America, in Germany. And Hitler had this book translated into German, and he had it on the desk in his office, or in the reception desk in his office, so that when people came in, they could pick up this book, which was written by an American, but supported Hitler's ideas of anti-Semitism. So really, both of these men were very, very dangerous and very influential in America. But that doesn't end the story in America, because at the same time, companies like IBM We're also helping Germany with recording minute details about who Jews were, what illnesses they had, what family relations they had, whether they had converted, etc., etc. And IBM helped Germany, even during the war, to record details which would help them with Germany's eugenics program, which was actually an American eugenics program. And I'm going to go into that later on in this course. I don't know, a few weeks down the line, I guess. If you're still with me, you might not be by then. But I'm going to look at that in detail. And so IBM was supporting Germany, but also where the eugenics program financial supporters such as the Rockefeller Foundation and other organizations, which we're going to look at later on again. So the atmosphere in America was particularly anti-Semitic. We're not very familiar with that story, but there has been a lot of research done on that subject, particularly by a man called Edwin Black, who I've mentioned already. But I'll introduce his books when we come to that part of the course. But all this is, it points us to the fact that America were particularly anti-Semitic. And also there were people in the UK who felt the same about eugenics, about stopping Jews from having children, etc., sterilizing them. But we'll come to that story later on. But I wanted to give you some background and atmosphere or feeling of what the atmosphere was like in the USA and the UK in the years just prior to Holocaust, and it gives you an idea of how we outside of Germany felt about the Jewish people. But now I want to take us to this group of people who were, for me, the most virulent Christian anti-Semites in the story or the narrative of Holocaust, and that's the German Christian Party. They were most active anti-Semitic Christian organization in Germany and Austria, and it was this Christian movement that became the voice of the Christians, the majority of Christians within Germany and Austria. Now, Germany was made up of 35% Catholic, or around 35% Catholic, and 60 to 65% Lutheran. And the Lutheran Church was the driving church in Germany. It was the church that was the voice to the people. So the Catholic Church did have an influence, and we looked at how they influenced the Nazi Party by saying they would support them in 1933, when Priscilla, who was the cardinal in Berlin, signed an agreement called the Concordat with Hitler in 1933. And we mentioned that last week. But Hitler knew that he had a huge amount of support from the German Christian Church, the Lutheran Church, if you like, the Evangelical Church, who were cruelly anti-Semitic and made statements openly which actually would lead ordinary Christians to believe that Jews were a danger to society, because those statements came from senior people within the Lutheran community in Germany prior to the war, and actually during the war as well. And we're going to look at these things. This movement of Protestant Christians began with ideas in the 1920s of integrating the Protestant church with German culture and ethnicity. Pastors called Siegfried Leffler and Julius Lethhauser preached about religious renewal along nationalistic lines. Do you remember when we looked at some of the things that led up to Holocaust? It was Germany was a country that was nationalistic. It wanted a super race, an Aryan race, and Leffler and Lethhauser preached about these ideas as well. Both were Nazi Party members. So these were leaders, these were pastors in the church, but they were Nazi Party members, which wasn't unusual for many of the very right-wing supremacist type Christians at the time. We have that today in America again, clearly, but these people in Germany were particularly influential. They said that all Protestants should support the Nazi ideology. In 1932, these pastors met clergy and politicians in Berlin to discuss how the Protestant Church could be invigorated into action in conjunction with the National Socialist cause. So how were they going to initiate support from within the Protestant Church for the Nazi Party? That was the focus of this conference in 1932. Now, there were 10 guidelines and principles published by the German Christian movement in 1932. These were anti-Jewish principles, and they involved ideas of race. Now, when I get to this eugenics part, you'll get a lot of meat on the bones here. But the idea of race, a super race, was something that was started to a point in the 1890s here in the UK, but then was developed by the Americans, who wanted a super race. Not an Aryan race. They called it a Nordic race. The Americans, a Nordic race, white European race, who would be a super race in America, who would lead the American movement, the establishment of American politics, etc. And this was quite a large movement. In fact, Roosevelt was in favor of that type of eugenics. So, the ideas of race came from America to Hitler when he was writing Mein Kampf. Now, I've got Mein Kampf here, and I'm not suggesting that any of you should read it. I read it for research purposes, but Mein Kampf is a really horrible book. But a lot of Mein Kampf was the ideas of a character assassination on the Jewish people came from eugenics in America. And because he received documents from Americans while he was in prison, and we talked about that again last week. So, but the idea of this, the idea of race was also part of the focus of the German Christian movement in the Protestant Lutheran Church. Principle 7 of these 10 guidelines or 10 principles stated that the mixing of race was to be opposed. And they looked at Jews not in terms of religion, they looked in terms of Jews in terms of race. And that was identical to how the Americans were looking at it and how Germany and the Nazi Party were looking at Jews. They weren't looking at religion, they were looking at race. And they were particularly, the German Christian movement, like the Nazi Party, were particularly against the mixing of race. So the mixing of Jews and the Aryan race. That was something that they were opposed to. And they set that out in this Principle 7 in 1932. Principle 9, this is in 1932, before the Nuremberg laws, Principle 9 called for marriage between Jews and Germans to be forbidden. So that wasn't necessarily a Nazi Party idea that manifested in the Nuremberg laws in 1933 to 1935. That actually was a principle within this German Christian movement, within the Protestant movement in Germany. This was before those laws, as I've said, before the Nazis took control of Germany, won the election, and before Hitler became the premier. So we see that the German Christian movement were already very anti-Semitic. Now, one of their leaders and one of their chaplains was a man called Ludwig Muller. And if you're making notes, you can actually Google these people, and they're well documented. And as I say, Yad Vashem and Washington Holocaust Museum have a lot of information on these guys, but you can Google them and get some information about them. So this one is Ludwig Muller. He was a military chaplain in the First World War. he was appointed a German Christian Protestant Reich Bishop in 1933. So right at the beginning of the Nazis taking power, Muller became a bishop. Muller was an associate of Hitler as well, and a member of the Nazi Party. And of course, he was anti-Semitic. Now, in 1934, Muller said this. He said, "We must emphasize with all decisiveness that Christianity did not grow out of Judaism, but developed in opposition to Judaism." So you may want me to repeat that, so I will. "We must emphasize," he said, in 1934, "with all decisiveness that Christianity did not grow out of Judaism, but developed in opposition to it." So he's saying Christianity is opposite to Judaism, opposite to the Jews, and he's a bishop. So in 1939, Muller called for a ban on Jewish influence in all areas of German life, including the church. And that's what he called for. Now, he wasn't just calling for a ban within the church of Jewish influence, which what did actually manifest itself later at the time through the German Christian movement, but he wanted every area of life in Germany to be cleansed, if you like, of Jewish influence. And now this is Muller. On the 13th of November 1933, another leader in this German Christian movement, a man named Reinhold Krauss. Reinhold Krauss, that's Krause. Google him as well if you want. Another Nazi Party member addressed a rally of 20,000 members at the Sports Palace in Berlin, 1933. Krauss spoke against many of the fundamental ideas in Christianity, stating that they were influenced by Jewish practice. He regarded the Old Testament as unacceptable, a remnant of Judaism. Now, the speech did become a divisive issue, but in reality, Germany was already looking at removing the Old Testament and many of the sermons of pro-Jewish people within the German community. But Krauss made this speech, which actually influenced many people against any references to Jews within theology, which is a strange thing. But actually, even before that, we've learned, haven't we, that replacement theology actually removed the Jewishness of Yeshua, Jesus. So, and you know, the worship practices that God set us were removed by other theologians in history. But so there's nothing new here, but it's emphasized in terms of anti-Semitism in Germany during the years leading up to the war, and this started in 1933 with Krauss. Now, the question of whether Jews who had converted to Christianity were still Jews was a hotly debated subject throughout all the denominations in the churches in Germany. In 1933, German Christian Friedrich Weinecke demanded a truly German church based on blood and not baptism. And this view opened the door to removing Jews from churches. Now, there are a lot of examples of Jews being removed from choirs, being removed from their positions as clergy, being removed from their posts as wardens, positions as priests, etc., and being part of the theological colleges. But the question of Jews who had converted was something which was a hot subject in 1933, and this guy Weinecke, it's Friedrich Weinecke, and it's Wieneke. Google him again. he actually said that the question of whether somebody was a Christian or not was based on their blood. So if they were an Aryan blood, they could be a Christian. That's what he was saying. But if it was Jewish blood that you had in you, you couldn't. Even though you had converted in your heart and your soul and joined the Christian community, absolutely, totally converted, because you had Jewish blood, then you were not acceptable as a Christian. And he called for the removal of Jews from the Christian church. One of the things that you might like to do this coming week is you might like to Google some of the posters for the German Christian movement in Germany during the Holocaust, and you'll see references to Jews in some of that propaganda and some of the material and some of the posters. So you might want to do that. But Weinecke was another anti-Semitic leader who was trying to drive Jews out of the churches. Now, the feeling in Germany regarding the Jews was very, very high, and of course Austria and other countries in Europe. But most countries were very anti-Semitic. But I think it's believed and understood by most historians that we in the UK and in America knew full well what was happening in Europe, and we knew about the Nuremberg laws. We knew about the persecution of Jews. We were fully aware of what was happening in Germany, and certainly that's why the Labour Party in the UK 1938 onwards was trying to help Jews, because we knew here that it was difficult for them, well, more than difficult. It was really really bad for them that they were under this heavy persecution and restrictions, and yet we were still in relationship with Germany. And one of the examples is in 1936, the Olympic Games took place in Germany and were opened by Hitler. More than 4 million tickets were sold, and 49 countries from around the world attended, including the USA, including ourselves. And we took part in the Olympic Games, knowing that this hatred of the Jews was at such a level that they weren't allowed to live normal lives in Germany. They weren't allowed to practice in their skills. Doctors were being restricted. Lawyers were being restricted. They weren't allowed into politics. There was a total apartheid movement, if you like, in Germany taking place, and yet we still took part in the Olympic Games, which Hitler opened. And German Christians celebrated those games. They also celebrated the 3rd anniversary of the National Revolution, which was when Hitler took power and this revolution, if you like, took place. And they sang a hymn in which they proclaimed Nazism to be a divine revelation, a revelation from God. And this is what they sang in this hymn, was that Hitler was God's emissary on earth. So that is the support that Hitler had from the German Christian movement at the time. And they knew what he was saying about Jews. They knew exactly what the restrictions that were placed on Jewish people. In April 1939, 11 regional German Christian movement churches signed something called the Goldsberg Declaration. You may want to Google that. Goldsberg Declaration, stating that Christianity was the religious opposite to Judaism, and announced the creation of something which was really influential and really spoke volumes about the Christian movement of the time. And that was the creation of the institution for research into the elimination of Jewish influence in German church life. Now, this for us today, especially if you're part of the Jewish roots movement within the church, which we are at Father's House, this is really difficult for us to understand, that you would want to eliminate Jewish influence within the church, because the Bible was written by Jews. Yeshua, our Lord Jesus, was a Jew. He spoke about the laws of God, upholding them and giving them the upper respect. He spoke about the Jewish people. Did he not weep for Jerusalem? Did he not say he was going to come back and judge the world for how they dealt with the Jews? You know, all our theology is Jewish. All the books of what you may call the Old Testament, I call it the Tanakh and the Torah, and the Gospels are written by Jews. Even Paul's letters, he was a Jew. He was a Torah-keeping Jew that told us to uphold the Torah, the laws of God. So it really is something that flies directly in the face of real theology. And the German Christian movement was desperate to try and eliminate any Jewish influence within the doctrine, the theology, within the daily life of the German church. Now, the Institute, and I'll say it again, Institute for the Study and Elimination of Jewish Influence on German Church Life, was established on the 6th of May, 1939. That was just before the war. And it was opened by the pastor I mentioned earlier on, who said, who looked for the elimination of Jewish influence, Siegfried Leffler. And he served in the Thuringian Ministry of Education. That's an area in Germany. Now, another main player in this anti-Semitic movement is who is somebody that I've spoken about on a number of occasions. There's a man called Walter Gutmann, and we're going to look at him, who was an academic director of the Institute. He was a major theologian in Germany, and he made an opening speech for this institute called the De-Judaization of the Religious Life as the task of German theology. Now, I've got some books here which have Grumman's influence on the theology, and I can tell you that he appears on the surface to be a very evangelical Christian, but he was particularly anti-Semitic, and there is no good said about Jews in any of his books or his writings. But this is what he said, called in this speech. What he said was the de-Judaization of the religious life should be the task of German theology. Now, 6,000 copies of his speech were distributed throughout the German church publishing house. So he was well respected, and what he said was influential. And he actually was one of the main players in the anti-Semitic movement within the German church. The second one is a man who was an associate and friend of Gutmann, was a man called Gerhart Kittle, a German Lutheran theologian. He died in 1948. In a lecture in June 1933, he spoke and titled his lecture, "The Jewish Question." This was in June 1933. This is just 3 months after Hitler came to power. And he said that this speech that he made soon appeared in print. And what he did, he spoke of the stripping of citizenship from German Jews. He said that German Jews should not be citizens within the social strata of society. He called for their removal from medicine and from law. I want to remind you, this guy is a Lutheran theologian of some respect. He asked for their removal from teaching, from journalism, and he called for the new government to forbid marriage or sexual relations with non-Jews. And he examined 4 ways to eliminate the Jews of Europe. This was in a speech in June 1933. It was hailed a major speech, and it influenced ordinary people, but it certainly influenced the Nazi Party into thinking that they could get away with the laws, the Nuremberg laws, which were to forbid marriage, to remove Jews from medicine, law, teaching, and journalism, to forbid sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews. And that was part of the eugenics idea as well, which had come from America, but Kittle had taken hold of that and was running with it as a representative of the German Christian Church, which, as I've said, represented somewhere around 65% of German people. Not all Protestants agreed with Kittle and Gutmann or Siegfried Loeffler and co, but an awful lot did, and they were very, very influential. And certainly they caught the ear of the Nazi Party, who thought, we've got the church on our side. And of course, with the Concordat, the Catholic Concordat with Priscilla, who eventually became the Pope during the war, being signed in the same month as Kittle, the Protestant leader, or one of the Protestant leaders, made this particularly anti-Semitic speech. What was interesting about his speech is that he called for ways to eliminate Jews of Europe, and he didn't look at gassing, he didn't look at extermination of the Jews. That developed very quickly later on, but he did look at ways of trying to get Jews out of Germany, looked at ways to restrict them, certainly, and looked at ways of eliminating any authority they had in Europe. So Kittle was a particularly nasty guy, and he's mentioned in these books that I've got as well, and particularly nasty anti-Semite. But let me go back to Gutmann. He died on the 30th of August 1976. He was a leading German theologian, and was in 1939 a founding member of this Institute for the Research of the Elimination of Jewish Influence in German Church Life. Long title, isn't it? Gutmann was a Nazi anti-Semite who, after the war, became an informer to the British forces and went on to become a leading Protestant theologian who called, still after the war, called for the removal of the Old Testament from within Christian theology. And he attended meetings in the United Kingdom. He had an influence in the churches here in the UK after the war, despite his anti-Semitic drive and being a leader in this institution for removing Jews and any influence of Jewish life within the church during the Holocaust. I think it's amazing that we allowed him even to influence us here in the UK, in the Anglican Church in the UK as well. So his writings are still influential. His books and his speeches, his preaches, his messages, his sermons are still sometimes quoted in German theology and the German churches. But again, he was a particularly rabid anti-Semite, portraying to be a leading Christian theologian. So the Institute produced the first anti-Semitic gospel. So you can imagine this institute of leading German Christian theologians, very active before and during the war, they produced these anti-Semitic gospels called the Message of God. And 200,000 copies of this Message of God, which had eliminated Jewish references in these so-called gospel messages, 200,000 copies were sold within the first 6 months of their creation, which shows you the influence that they had. 200,000 copies is a lot of books. I mean, they continued to sell them, but within the first 6 months, that was the number of copies that was sold. This version removed some of the verses which says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." That's Luke 23:34. So let's look at that verse. It's what Yeshua says about the Jewish people, about the Jewish leaders, not the Jewish people, but the Jewish leaders. He says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Yeshua is asking for Jews to be forgiven. That, to the German Christian movement, and particularly to Kittle and Gutmann and Leffler and Muller and all these guys, forgiveness for Jews was not acceptable. So they removed that verse from the Bible. They also changed the 10 Commandments, and they were really strange. The 10 Commandments that they replaced were quite different in many ways, but this is what they were. The first one was honor God and believe him wholeheartedly. And this is the English translation from the German. So seek out the peace of God. Avoid all hypocrisy. Holy is your health and your life, because there was a particular emphasis on health being part of the eugenics movement in Germany at the time. So health and life were particularly important. So holy is your health and life. Holy is your well-being and honor. Holy is your truth and fidelity. Honor your father and mother. And this is particularly important. This is number 8 of the new 10 Commandments, as they wrote. Keep the blood pure and the marriage holy. Well, we've just spoken about blood. They didn't want any mixing of blood with the Jewish people, or actually other people as well, gypsies and other groups as well, but particularly Jews. That was the meaning of this. Keep your blood pure and the marriage holy. Now, the marriage was not considered holy if you were married to a Jew. So this is Commandment 8. Keep the blood pure and the marriage holy. Maintain and multiply the heritage of your forefathers. So this was the Aryan heritage that they were speaking about. So maintain and multiply the heritage of your forefathers. Now, this again comes into this eugenics idea that which stemmed from America, that your heritage, if you were Aryan heritage, you wanted to multiply that heritage. So you were encouraged in America and in Germany to, if you were of a high standing particularly, but you were Aryan in Germany, then you were to multiply and have a lot of children. But there was a restriction on those who were not of Aryan blood and maybe had some form of mental illness or physical illness in Germany. And in fact, if that was the case, then you were sterilized in Germany from 1926 onwards. There was a sterilization program. I might be wrong there with the date, but certainly from 1933, when Hitler came to power, then there was a sterilization program that took place in Germany, which involved not only sterilization in forms of vasectomy or sterilizing a woman, but there was also castration of people who had mental illness, who had alcohol problems, who would they didn't want to have children, basically, so they did that. So it says, part 10, be ready to help and forgive. That's command 10. There's actually 12 commandments in this, so honor your, and number 11 of the 10 commandments, if you like, honor your Führer and master. So you had to honor the Führer, honor Hitler. That was a command within the New Testament. And then 12, joyously serve the people with work and sacrifice. So this was an idea that was serving the state, serving the your Aryan brothers and sisters, was something that was to be done and worked hard for, and to actually you were to sacrifice for the good of Germany and the Reich. So they were the 10 commandments. Now, although we hear about some of the Jewish pastors or anti-Nazi pastors, one of those is a man called Niemöller, Martin Niemöller. Many of you will have heard of him, that he was an outspoken anti-Nazi pastor. And and his name is Martin Niemöller, I'll spell it Niemorre. And although he spent 7 years in concentration camps because of his opposition to Hitler, he was a political activist. And although he opposed the plans to eject non-Aryans from the church, he still professed he was an anti-Semite. So when the non-Aryan controversy within the church was discussed, Niemöller suggested that those who had Jewish ancestry and who were holding church office, he requested them to resign to spare their Christian brothers having to make difficult decisions. So Niemöller, although he stood against Nazi Germany, still had anti-Semitic views and wanted Jews who were within the church to resign voluntarily rather than having to be thrown out to save the embarrassment on the Aryan Christian leaders. So we do see, even though there was opposition to the Nazis in the church, that actually a lot continued to be anti-Semitic. Now it's 8 o'clock now, and I wanted then now to move on to the aspect of the police battalions that I spoke about previously in the other 2 sessions. Ordinary men, I spoke about it in the first session. Ordinary men, how did they become killers? Well, I don't want to start this now because we'll start this next week, but I'll just recap on what we've said this evening, and that is that the reason ordinary people became killers and murderers of the Jewish people is because they were taught to hate them. Not only were they taught to hate them by the church in the 1920s and the 1930s, but they were taught by the politicians to hate Jews. They were taught, as we've seen tonight, by the church to hate Jews. And ordinary people, whether you were Catholic, whether you were Protestant, grew up with this anti-Semitic teaching, which created this atmosphere in society which was such that Jews could be eliminated without much opposition. And in fact, Christians could be used to kill Jews, because where did the killers come from? Many of them came from the churches, and many of them went back into the churches when they came home on leave, or after the war. They went back into the churches. They professed to be Christians, and yet had murdered or were murdering Jews en masse because they had been taught that Jews were subhuman. It's part of the stages of genocide that we looked at that has developed into murder. And those ordinary people, men and women, because there were women involved as well, were enabled to kill Jews because they saw them as subhuman, and they saw them as a threat to Christianity. And that's why this institute was called for, to remove Jewish influence in the church. And now we see that the German Christian movement had even changed the Bible to reflect their anti-Semitism. And in fact, I haven't mentioned yet, but that hymn books were removed. Any hymns, the hymn books which had references to Israel, or any references to Jews, or references to Judaism in them, the hymn books were changed and reduced to just a few hymns which didn't reference Israel or the Jews. So if you were a soldier or a volunteer or a member of a group who were part of the elimination process of the Jews, or maybe you were a secretary in an office, maybe you were a train driver, maybe you were a part of the laundry unit who were washing the clothes of the SS men and the Einsatzgruppen and the police battalions who shot Jews. Maybe you were one of those, but you would have been influenced to hate Jews, so would have carried on with those duties, believing that it was part of a movement which was good for the German people. So I hope I've given you some background again tonight, leading up to Holocaust, and we will move further into Holocaust as time goes on, and we will look at some of the police units who killed Jews next time, and we'll examine these ordinary men who killed Jews because they hated them. So I hope that you've learned something tonight, and I've learned quite a bit, because I've relearned what I've learned about these years within the Protestant and Catholic Church in Germany leading up to the Holocaust. So I want to say good night, Lila Toff, and if you've got any questions, I'm going to take off my PowerPoint now and just see if you've got any questions that you can ask on the live chat before we finish tonight. So there's no questions coming up. So Lila Toff, God bless you, and we'll see you next week at 7 o'clock. Good night.